wrestling legend Jerry Lawler. You can do better than that. Up on your feet for crying out loud. One more time, Jerry Lawler.
Sorry, I jumped the gun. I didn't wait for the introduction. But it's your fault. You told me to go, right?
No.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
So cool.
This is awesome.
Yes, it is awesome.
So before we get to the audience questions, anything you want to say, or you want to jump right into the questions? It's just so nice to have you here.
Well, thank you. No, it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at Steel City Con, and I'm just blown away by it, especially to be in the same room. To be in the same room with not only all of you fine people, but with the Christmas vacation car back there. That's so awesome. I got to go back there and get my picture with that before this is over.
Oh, yeah. So,
I don't know. This is the first time. I've done a lot of Comic-Cons. I've done a lot of these, what do you call them? Panels, but never by myself. So
this is great.
I'm going to depend on you to help me with this.
Well, I want to get right to the beginning. You started off as a disc jockey. How did that lead to wrestling?
That's a good question.
See, I'm going to start off.
Very good question to start off with. Yeah, you know what? Somebody just mentioned a while ago, they mentioned my Superman ring that I wear all the time. And because when I kind of look back at all the crazy stuff that's gone on through my life, it all kind of started in my mind or my memory. Most of my memories are in black and white. So it goes back to the 1950s when Superman TV show came on TV for the first time. George Reeves it's my all-time favorite Superman. Most people don't even realize who George Reeves is, but was. But anyway, I became just a huge Superman fan. And about that same time, I realized that I had the ability to draw pictures. And so, like I said, this was about 5 or 6 years old. So I started drawing constantly Superman. I mean, so then I just kept drawing Superman all the time. Instead of when I started in school, I'd get notes sent home from the teacher to my mom and saying, kid's a great artist, but he needs to concentrate on his schoolwork. But he just draws all the time. So I think I'm trying to remember the first time I realized that I saw Superman comic books. I was always just a big fan of the Superman TV show. Then I saw Superman comic books as I got a little older, and that is when I made up my mind that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a comic book artist for DC Comics. I wanted to draw Superman and Batman when I got older. So all throughout school, I majored in art, and even when I finally graduated, I won a full tuition scholarship to University of Memphis for commercial art. And somewhere there, when I just got out of high school, was the first time I got interested. My dad was a big wrestling fan, and it was the first time I sort of got interested in watching wrestling. There in Memphis, we had a Saturday morning wrestling show that came on, a 90-minute long Saturday morning live wrestling show every Saturday. And so started watching that with my dad, and all of a sudden I realized, or I thought in my mind, I said, gosh, I've been drawing superheroes all my life, and I'm looking on TV, and I said, these guys are like real-life superheroes. So then I started drawing pictures of wrestlers, and the drawing sort of leads up to everything. You asked me about being a DJ. At that same time, I think I was just actually a senior in high school. I hadn't actually graduated yet, but there was a big name DJ who came through Memphis from California named Scott Shannon. Now, Scott, believe it or not, is still on the air today. He left Memphis, went to New York, and became the top DJ in New York City, and he's still on an oldies station in New York City today, Scott Shannon. But he came through Memphis in 1965, 66, something like that. I graduated in 67, but he had a radio show that everybody listened to, all the teenagers at least, listened to every single night. And one night, or one week on a show, he had this character. Radio was so great at the time, you didn't have to see anything. You visualize this stuff in your mind. And Scott Shannon had this segment in his show every night where he said that He told everybody that he had a creature that he kept down in the basement or the dungeon of the radio station, and he called it a gazork. That was his name for this creature, this gazork. And what he would do, he had a segment on his show. He said, hey, if anybody out there, he said, I have to feed this thing like 6 or 7 times a day. It just eat me out of house and home. And he said, he'll eat absolutely anything. So if anybody out there is having a problem with a teacher or principal or somebody that's giving you a problem, you give me their name and I'll feed them to the gazork. So this became a big deal in the city. Everybody's calling up, and I think I called up one time and I said, yeah, my principal, Mr. Mabry, man, I had to go in. He gave me a paddling today, right? And he said, well, you know what? I just happen to have Mr. Mabry right here in my studio. And then you'd hear a voice in the background. Somebody starts screaming. He said, no, come here, Mr. Mabry. And he said, you're getting fed to the gazork. And then you'd hear this big monster chewing. Like I said, this is all in your mind. You hear this thing chewing something up. And then all of a sudden they go, burp, big burp at the end. And he said, well, Jerry, you're not going to have a problem with Mr. Mabry anymore. And so that was a big thing. And so all of a sudden, one week, he announced that he was going to have a contest for fans out there that listen to the show to draw what you thought the gazork looked like. Bingo. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, right down my alley. And the first prize was a color TV, right? A color TV. Second prize was a stereo and all of this kind of stuff. And we had a black and white TV, so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, if I could win a color TV just by drawing, this would be the greatest thing in my life. So I sat down and I started drawing gazork pictures, and I must have done about 50. And I sent them all into the station. And the day before they were going to have the unveiling of the winner, announce the winner, it was going to be at the grand opening of this new mall in Memphis called Southland Mall. And this was like one of the first. Like I said, this goes back to the 60s when malls were just getting started, right? So this was a big deal. They're opening a mall. First ever live appearance by the DJ Scott Shannon, and they're going to announce the winner of this contest. So I go out there, but the day before the contest, I'm sitting at home that night, the day before the contest announcement, I'm sitting at home and my phone rings, and I answer it. I never forget that voice. It's Scott Shannon on the telephone calling me at home. And he says, Jerry Lawler. And I said, yeah. He said, this is Scott Shannon, man. And I'm like, oh my gosh. He said, listen, I just want you to know that I loved your artwork. I loved your pictures of the gazork. I'm going to use one in my advertising. He said, but he said, the only problem was the station thought that you sent in so many, like I said, I sent in like 50 entries. He said, you sent in so many entries that they're going to award you, they were afraid to award you the first prize because they thought that would be rigged or something because you sent in so many entries, but you won second prize. So I was disappointed that I didn't win the color TV, but anyway, I got this nice stereo and all this sort of stuff. But the next day when I go to the announcement and the appearance for the first time of Scott Shannon, it's a huge crowd, partly for the grand opening, but this guy was such a big name in town. It was the first ever time that anybody got to see him in person. I'd never seen him, so all of a sudden they introduced, just like you did, they introduced, here he is, Scott Shannon, comes out, they got thousands of people there, right? And I'm standing looking over his shoulder, and all of a sudden here comes this guy out. He's in a white jumpsuit like Elvis Presley, no shirt on. He's got this white scarf around his neck, long blonde hair, and the girls are like going crazy. They're just going nuts. It was like Beatlemania again, right? And I'm looking around and I thought, heck, forget about being a DJ. Forget about being an artist. I want to be a DJ like this guy, right? So I get awarded the second prize, and then he calls me off to the side and says, look, I want you to come down to the studio, come down to the station. He said, I want to talk to you about you doing some artwork for me every week for my radio show. At that time, he would put out a top 40 list of all the records, like the Hot 100 records or whatever. And he wanted me to do a caricature of him And like this is just a time that's gone by. I mean, there used to be record stores and that sort of stuff, and he put these surveys out in the record stores every week, and I would draw a picture on it. So I would get to go down to the station every week with my new piece of artwork with Scott Shannon. And then I got to, after a while, became friends with him and got to hang out and watch him do the radio show. And after a few weeks, I finally got the nerve up to tell him, man, this is something, Scott, that I would love to do. And I just started in college then. So he helped me make a reel, like a promo reel. He got all the records out, and while the record was playing, he's making a promo reel for me. He told me what to say, turned the microphone on, and I did this stuff, and all of a sudden he made me this tape where it sounded like I was a real DJ. And he said, you take this tape around to radio stations. He said, first thing, take it to, take it around the radio station, you might get a job. And sure enough, I took the tape. I knew really nothing about it. I let him make the tape for me. And but I took the tape around, and I got hired at a radio station as a DJ on a country music station, and all of a sudden I got the same shift that Scott Shannon was on. I was on from 7 to midnight playing freaking country music. And I'm a teenager playing country music, and Scott Shannon's got all the kids listening to him over there. But he said, kid, you got your foot in the door. Take any job you can get. So that's where I started out as a DJ. And when I look back on all this crazy stuff that happened in my life, everything was so coincidental. While I was on this country music station, in the afternoons, the local wrestling show advertised on the country music station, right? And so the station that I was on was a little small station, KWAM, still on the air somehow, but in Memphis. But it was in the studio was in a little small Quonset hut. The whole studio was about as big as from here to that wall to that post right there. That was the size of the whole place. And so every week, though, on Monday nights when the wrestling was in town, they would send a wrestler by the studio to make a radio interview. So I'm all of a sudden just sitting there in the afternoons getting ready for my show, and then some wrestler, Jackie Fargo, would come in. He was like the big name wrestler in the town. Jackie Fargo would come in the station, and he'd have 2 or 3 beautiful girls with him. He'd drive up in a big Cadillac, and he'd come in, and thousands of people are going to come see him that Monday night, and he'd go into the studio there with Eddie Bond, the other DJ, and he'd cut a promo about who he was going to beat up that Monday night. And I'm watching this every week. He's coming. These wrestlers are pulling up in these big, nice Cadillacs and got pretty girls with them and everything. And I'm thinking, I'm in this little Quonset. I'm thinking, man, being a wrestler would be a lot better than being a DJ, right? So that's where I first got it in my mind. And then a little bit after that, I sent some of my drawings into the TV station my drawings of wrestlers into the TV station. They aired the wrestling on Saturday mornings. And I got a call from the unmistakable voice of Lance Russell, who was he was the announcer on our wrestling show there in Memphis. Calls me up on my phone, and he said, "Is Jerry Lawler?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we got your pictures. Everybody likes them. We're going to show them on the air this Saturday. And as a matter of fact, one of our wrestlers wants to meet you because he wants to know if he can hire you to do some drawing on he owned a nightclub. He wanted to hire you to do some drawing on his nightclub." And that was Jackie Fargo, who was the big shot wrestler in town at the time. So I got to go down to the TV station. They showed my artwork on TV, and I got to meet Jackie Fargo. He hired me to come and do some drawings at his club, and he and I became friends after that. And he was the guy that finally, like I did Scott Shannon, I started asking Jackie, "Is there any way that, I would love to try this one time. Could I just be one of the Saturday morning guys that you guys throw in there and beat up, the job guy or whatever?" And he discouraged me at first, but finally he stuck his neck out to the promoters and let me be one of those guys that they threw in on Saturday mornings. And that's how I got started in the business. That was 52 years ago. And I've been doing it ever since. He actually told me at first, he said, I'll never forget, he said, "Kid, you're too good an artist. You don't want to get involved with wrestling. Stick with being an artist." And I told him, I said, Jackie, if you just let me try it one time, I promise you I'll go back to being an artist. I won't bother you anymore. Just let me do it one time. Of course, that was 52 years later, and I've been wrestling ever since. I just had my first match was in December of 1970, and I just had my last match last Saturday night in Toms River, New Jersey. So been doing it constantly for 52 years. And it all started with Superman.
Oh, what a great story. Boy, I'm glad I asked that one.
Yeah. Let's get shorter answers from now on, though.
Did you always use your real name even when you were the DJ?
Yes. Well, no, not when I was a DJ. You're right. I didn't think about that. And I don't even know. I kept my initials, JL, but as a DJ, I was Jeff Lane. And I think the Lane came from Lois Lane. So anyway, yeah, I was Jeff Lane as a DJ. And then, but once I got into wrestling, it just was always Jerry Lawler.
So I got one more question before we open it up to the audience. And I got to ask you, how did your relationship with Andy Kaufman start? And how did that grow? How did that even happen?
How many people have already heard this story a million times?
Not me.
Oh, good. Not
please.
You. Okay, well, let me just tell you. No, Andy Kaufman was without a doubt the greatest thing that ever happened to my career, and one of the greatest things that ever happened to wrestling. I just had dinner probably about 3 weeks ago. It's funny. This is a better story than Andy Kaufman. About 3 weeks ago, I have a restaurant that's basically right on the end of my street. It's a Japanese restaurant called Sakura. I go there for sushi a lot and everything. So my son, Kevin, calls me and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm just sitting at home. He said, want to go to dinner? And I said, okay, come over. We'll go to Sakura right by my street. He gets over to my house about 6 o'clock. We go down, sit, have dinner, talk, get through, back to my house, and it's about 8:15. I drop him off. He gets in his car and leaves. So at about 8:25, my phone rings, and I look at it, and it's an Indiana number, just a number that I didn't have in my phone. And I started not to answer it because I didn't recognize it. Then I thought, it might be a promoter from Indiana, want to book a show or something like that. So I answered it. And this voice on the other end was a young guy, and he goes, oh my gosh, Mr. Lawler, I'm so glad you answered. And I said, who is this? And he tells me his name, and he said, I was supposed to call you 2 days ago. He said, Nick Khan has just flown into Memphis on a WWE corporate jet, and he's having dinner with The Rock, and I was supposed to call you 2 days ago and invite you to be at the dinner with them. And he said, unfortunately, it's happening in about 2 minutes. It's at 8:30, and it was like 8:28 at the time. And he said, I just forgot to call you. I don't know what to do. And I said, well, where is it at? And he said, Folks Folly. And I said, well, you know what? You're in luck, because Folks Folly, like top wrestler in Memphis, is like 1 minute from my house. So I said, I'll throw on a different shirt, and I'll be there by 8:32. And he said, oh my gosh, please don't tell him that I forgot to call you, would you please? I said, no, I won't say it. So anyway, I get there at like 8:30, change shirts, go over to Folks Folly, walk in the back room, and there's The Rock and Nick Khan, who's the new CEO of WWE, right? And they got a seat right next to The Rock waiting for me, like they thought I had been invited 3 days ago. So I just walked in at a moment's notice, sat down with The Rock, and we sat and we had dinner for like 3 hours. And one of the things that he said to me, getting back to Andy Kaufman, was he said, King, I don't know if you believe this or not, he said, but I would probably not be a movie star today if you had not ever had the wrestling match with Andy Kaufman. Because he believes, as Triple H has said too, that match with Andy Kaufman back in 1982 started the crossover of wrestling and Hollywood, basically, so to speak. It got so much publicity and so much notoriety back in those days that Vince McMahon, immediately after that, if you remember, that was the time, and it was because of the notoriety that Andy Kaufman got. Vince later told me, he said, I was so freaking jealous when I was sitting there in New York and watching you and Andy Kaufman on the David Letterman show. He said, because, New York was that was his territory, and here's a Memphis wrestler up there when it could have been done, he thought, with one of his wrestlers. But so right after Andy Kaufman and I did our deal there, immediately the next WrestleMania, he brought in Cyndi Lauper, he brought in Mr. T, and then that just started the ball rolling, all the Hollywood stuff. And then and like The Rock said, if that had not happened, there would have never been that crossover where wrestler would not have been even thought about to be in movies and that sort of thing. So, I felt good about that. But Andy Kaufman was a great guy, best thing that ever happened to my career. And it was sort of like when I look back on all the stuff that happened, it was just kind of a coincidence or whatever that had happened. He just fell in my lap, so to speak. Andy was a huge wrestling fan as a kid growing up. He said he used to do nothing but stay in his room, watch TV constantly. And one of the main things that he loved to watch, he was from Long Island, New York, was wrestling. And his favorite wrestler was the big bad guy at the time, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. He was a huge fan of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. And I sat with Andy when he was telling me his whole history, and he said, I would watch this guy, and I could tell, I'm like 10 years old, and he said, I could tell that he was intentionally trying to make me not like him, which he was, he was being a bad guy on TV, right? He said, I could tell he was intentionally trying to make me not like him, but I still liked him. And so he said that sort of stayed with me throughout my entire career. And if you go back and look at Andy Kaufman's stuff, he said, I'm not a comedian. I hate to be called a comedian. I've never told a joke in my life. And he said, I'm like a wrestler. I'm a performance artist. And he said, I enjoy, after watching the bad guy wrestlers, I always enjoyed making my audience feel uncomfortable. And if you ever watched any of Andy's stuff, that's what he did. He even created a bad guy persona with Tony Clifton, so that he could play the bad guy in his comedy shows. And then once he got on Taxi, and he got to that I guess sort of the height of his popularity, he decided that he wanted to live out his childhood fantasy of being not just a bad guy, but a bad guy wrestler. So that's when he started wrestling women. He felt like he wasn't a big enough guy to wrestle men, so he started wrestling women in his nightclub act. He went on TV shows, Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas, all of these shows, Saturday Night Live and stuff, wrestling women at the time. And he felt like it just wasn't being accepted the way he thought it should be by wrestling fans. So then he set out on a mission to get to wrestle women in front of a wrestling crowd. So he approached Vince McMahon Sr. at a show in Long Island, New York, and he told him the whole deal and how he wanted to wrestle women, that he'd been wrestling women, and he told Mr. McMahon, and this is Vince's father now, Vince McMahon Sr., so he told him he would like to wrestle women at one of his shows in front of wrestling fans. And thank goodness Vince said, well, Andy, I appreciate that, but he said, I'm just hesitant to involve an actor, because Andy was on Taxi at the time. He said, I'm hesitant to involve a Hollywood actor with my wrestling because I think it might make the audience think that we're all just actors, which basically we were, but he didn't want people to think that. So he turned Andy down. And I had a good friend named Bill Apter, who's magazine editor. Bill still is a wrestling magazine editor. He overheard the conversation. He knew Andy. He called Andy off to the side and said, look, I got a friend down in Memphis, Jerry Lawler, and he and his partner, Jerry Jarrett, have an entire territory. They run wrestling shows every night of the week. At Monday nights at the Mid-South Coliseum, they draw 10,000 fans, So he gave Andy my number, and the next day, Bill Apter called me and said, hey, you know Andy Kaufman? I said, I know who he is, the guy on Taxi, right? He said, yeah. He said, well, he's going to call you tomorrow. I said, Andy Kaufman's going to call me? He said, yeah, he wants to wrestle girls in front of wrestling fans. And I told him you guys might be interested in doing it down in Memphis. And so I said, oh, yeah. And so sure enough, Andy calls me the next day and tells me what his idea was. And I said, come on down. And all of the rest, I mean, that was what was intended to happen with Andy Kaufman and wrestling in Memphis. He came down, we brought him down just to go out. And the first week, sold out with him. He'd send in some interviews, kind of making fun of women, making fun of wrestling, that sort of thing. And he came to Memphis. We had a sellout at the Mid-South Coliseum. And the whole deal was Andy would go out to the ring. He would challenge women in the audience, and they would raise their hand if they wanted to win $500 if anybody could beat Andy Kaufman in the ring in 3 minutes. And so he, I mean, it was all legit. He went out to the ring. Women in the audience raised their hand. They picked out 5 different women, and they all came down. They each one of them got 3 minutes in the ring with Andy Kaufman, and you know, he was able to beat every one of them. And that was it. We thought that was going to be the whole thing. And he came back afterwards, and he was so excited. And me and Jerry, my partner, were just looking out at 10,000 people, and we said, "This is awesome, right?" So we said, "Andy, would you like to come back again next week and have it like a return, do it again?" And he said, "Oh, could I?" We said, "Yeah, you could." You know, we were drawing crowds like this. So that's how it all turned out, and or that's how it all started out, and all of the stuff where finally I went to Andy as you know, he came back about 3 times wrestling just women, and I finally went to Andy and said, "Look, you know, this has probably gone about as far as it can go with you wrestling women." I said, "What you need to do is you need to go ahead and have a match with a man." And he said, No, I couldn't do that. I couldn't get in the ring with a wrestler. I'll get hurt. And the TV studios, taxi and all the insurance people wouldn't allow me to do that. So I said, "Andy, you and I," thinking, how do I get the rub off the Hollywood star, right? So I said, "You and I could have a match, and I promise you wouldn't get hurt, and we would sell this place out, you know, because the people, I mean, by this time they in Memphis especially, they hated Andy Kaufman because he was just, you know, he's making fun of the South, he's making fun of women, and so you know, they were looking for somebody to put him in his place. So that's how the stuff with Andy and I got started, and it just went from there. And people always ask me, I mean, so much of the stuff that Andy and I did was like on the spur of the moment, ad lib, just like on the David Letterman show. When we went on that show, nobody, David Letterman, Andy Kaufman, nobody knew that I was going to slap Andy Kaufman on that show. We had a production meeting earlier in the day with the well, I had a meeting with him. Actually, Andy had a meeting with him earlier when I walked in to meet Robert Morton, who was the segment coordinator on the Letterman show, and where they would tell you what you were going to be on and what you were going to do on the show. I walked in to meet him, and he said, "Jerry, Andy refused to be in the same room with you." So I met with him earlier, and he's already gone. And he said, "Here's what we're going to do tonight." He said, "Dave's going to have you guys on for 2 segments. First segment, he wants you guys to be a little bit antagonistic. They'll show the film of Andy making fun of wrestling and making fun of Memphis, and then we'll show the film of you pile driving Andy and hurting his neck. And then Dave would like you guys to be a little antagonistic, not too much, and then we'll take a break. And then the second segment, Andy will apologize to you for making fun of wrestling. You apologize to Andy for hurting his neck, and then Andy is going to get up and sing, 'What the world needs now is love, sweet love.'" So that was what he told me, and I said, "Okay, that's cool." And I left, and I went back to the hotel, and so that was what everybody thought was going to happen. When I went back to the hotel there in New York, I got a call from Andy, and he said, "Well, did they tell you what they want us to do?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, it'll be funny, but," I said, "once you and I, you know, kiss and make up on network TV, that'll be the end of us doing anything back down in Memphis. You know, we won't be able to continue our wrestling program down there." And he said, "Yeah, man." And he hesitated. Then he said, I'll never forget because he didn't really use these terms, but he said, "Wonder what would happen if all of a sudden you just hauled off and slugged me." And I said, "Slugged you?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Oh, Andy, we can't do that. They're taping the show at 5:30 to show back at 11:30. They'll never show it." I said, "Second of all, I'll get arrested, and I can't do that. I got to be back in Memphis tomorrow." And he said, "Yeah, but wouldn't that be great?" And I said, I guess. But anyway, and then I didn't even think any more about it, right? So we go to the show that afternoon, 5:30. That was the first time I ever even met David Letterman, when you didn't get to talk or see David before the show. So I finally walked out on the stage, shook hands with David Letterman, then they bring out Andy, and I'm thinking that, we're going to do what the segment coordinator said to do. So we went to the first segment. We were a little bit antagonistic like they asked us, and then finally Dave cut to a break. Andy gets up and walks away. He walks off to the other side of the studio because he didn't want to sit beside me. And I'll never forget when we went to a break, all of a sudden David Letterman leans over and says, "Hey, my first job in television, I used to be the ring announcer for Dick the Bruiser in Indianapolis." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, so I know a lot about wrestling." I said, "Well, cool." And that was it with me and Dave. So then Andy comes back. We do the second segment, and he never apologized to me. Basically, we just kept going on and on and on. He's talking about how he could have sued me and all this sort of stuff. And I never apologized to him for hurting his neck. And so I guess Dave eventually said, "Well, this has gone off the tracks." And so we'd gone too long. And so Dave just said, "Well, we're going to take a break, and we're going to see if we can get this all sorted out." So all of a sudden, Paul Schaefer started playing the music, and I knew we were going to a break, and I knew we were out after that. That was our second segment. And still to this day, when I watch it back on TV, it's like watching somebody else. It's like an out-of-body experience. I don't know what I was thinking. I just stood up, I looked Andy in the eyes, and I just slapped the taste out of his mouth. I hit him so freaking hard that it knocked him right out of his chair and over and tumbled over and everything. And I'll never forget, I looked back at Dave, and this all happened right here, and he's just looking forward at the camera. He's just like... He had no clue what had just happened or what was going to happen, right? And so they went ahead and went to a break, and a security guard came and got me and took me back to the green room, which was full of people when I left to go out. And then when they brought me back there, it was like empty. Everybody's bringing Jerry Lawler back here. Whoa, let's get out of here. So I sat down in the green room for like maybe 15 minutes went by. And I guess they're trying to figure out what to do. And you could hear women out there that sound like people were crying and stuff. And poor Andy's holding his head. And so finally, after about 15 minutes, the door kind of opened up a little bit. And this young intern stuck his head in and said, "Mr. Lawler?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Dave wants to know if you want to come out and sort of wrap this thing up." So I said, "Sure." Now I'm thinking, maybe they're gonna show that, or are we gonna retape something or whatever? So I walked back out, and it was funny. There was 750 people in the studio audience for the David Letterman show, and from the time after I slapped Andy and went back to the dressing room, when I came out the second time, they had like turned into a wrestling crowd. They just like boo, it was like boo, boo. Okay. So I sit back down. We come back on the air, and right before we went on the air, they were doing 10, 9, 8, and Andy's still over in the corner holding the side of his head. And Dave said, "Andy, are you going to come back out here or what?" And he says, "No, if I do, I'll say words you can't say on television." So it was like 3, 2, 1, here we go. And then Dave had taken over that show. Just this was like the first few months of this new show. It used to be Tom Snyder, and the Tomorrow Show was on in that segment. So we come back on, and Dave said, "Well, Andy Kaufman's here, sort of, and Jerry Lawler's here, and some nights I wish Tom Snyder were still here, but that's not the case tonight." And then he said, "Andy, are you coming back out here?" And so all of a sudden, I'm just sitting there not knowing what to expect, right? So Andy comes over Dave's shoulder right here, and he lets out the most obscene string of profanity that you've ever seen. Now I'm thinking in my mind, "Oh my gosh, now they're probably going to show the slap, but there's no way they can show this." I mean, it was MF, it was everything you could think of, right? On network TV. He's calling me every name in the book. And I'm thinking, you're killing this whole thing, Andy. So I just kind of, with my body language, I just kind of like, to try to show him, what are you doing, right? So he just keeps cursing at me and everything. And now once again, here's Dave again. He's just like looking in the camera like he don't know what's going on either, right? And so Andy curses me, and then he stops and he says, I'm sorry to all my fans out there for saying these words, but you're an effing a-hole, you know. God, right? And then he grabs Dave's water and throws it at me, and I jump up again, and then the security guard comes back in, and then the security guard gets me this time, and he says, come on, Mr. Lawler, I want to get you to the elevator and get you out of here because he said Kaufman's elevator don't go all the way to the top floor. He said he's gonna have you arrested. So they took me to the elevator. I went down. I went back to my hotel, and this was at like 6:30. I didn't hear another word from anybody until 11:30 that night when the show came on the air, and I turned it on, and they showed everything. I mean, they showed the slap. They showed Andy coming out. They didn't beep out the curse words. It was even funnier. They put the sound of a cuckoo clock. So when Andy's going, it was going cuckoo, 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 cuckoo. So it was like hilarious, and you could lip read everything that he was saying. And so, I mean, as soon as the show went off the air, the next call that came in was New York Times. And it was crazy. It got that thing got so much publicity, and so many people were talking about it. Like literally worldwide. It started with all the publicity. But I mean, and that's how it all happened. And then of course Andy and I went back to Memphis, and a lot of people thought that we just had that one match, but Andy loved wrestling so much, and he kept coming back. He was on my show. I mean, Andy and I must have had 30 matches after that, week after week after week. He put out a bounty on me for wrestlers to come in. He would give $10,000 to any wrestler that could put me in the hospital with a pile driver. I threw fire in his face one day, and he was all burned up. We just did things over and over and over, and he just kept coming back until finally he was on my show one day. I had also had the Saturday morning wrestling show, and then I had a Sunday morning Jerry Lawler show that was like a sports talk show. I would have different guests on. I had Andy, because he was in town that week, as a guest, and it was around Thanksgiving or something. And so we had a little segment where we had a big turkey body on the thing, and we were going to put somebody's head on that turkey, you know, and we were going to show everybody today who's the turkey of the year in Memphis wrestling. And we're going to actually have him on the show. We're going to interview him today. And all of a sudden, I said, but first I got somebody that wants to say something. So then, of course, we had Andy in the other studio, and he comes on and he says, let me tell you something, Jerry Lawler, if you put my head on that turkey, I promise you, it'll be the last thing that you ever do. And he said, and when he was talking, he said, if you put my head on that turkey, I promise you. And so he was coughing several times, and then after the interview was over, he was like in the other end of the studio. We had another camera on him, and it looked like he was in somewhere else, but after the interview was over and the show went off, he came to me and he said, look, I apologize for coughing during that interview. He said, but I just got diagnosed with lung cancer. And it was like in the movie. I thought it was going to be another one of his bits, that it was going to be a joke or something, you know, that he was going to tell people that he had lung cancer, and then, of course, you know, it'd just be a prank or something. But I said, oh, Andy, that's not funny. And he said, no, I'm serious. So anyway, that was one of the last TV shows that he was on, and then literally right after that, he lost his hair, and he wasn't on TV anymore. But I mean, that was right when he got. He only lasted probably about 4 months after that before he passed away. But anyway, that's how it happened.
Amazing story. Now, if you don't mind, can we get some questions from the audience?
Sure,
Are we good?
Absolutely.
If you could come out to the middle of the aisle. We'll get some of your questions. How are you on time? Can you do some? Because we got.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, good.
One of my favorite feuds that you did was with Kamala, and I know that you helped create the Kamala gimmick. Do you know why Kamala is not in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I did actually create Kamala. Anybody here know who Kamala was, the wrestler? Yeah. Well, anyway, he was Kamala the Ugandan Giant, and in actuality, he was James Harris from Senatobia, Mississippi. And I was wrestling at the Mid-South Coliseum one Monday night, and I got tapped on the shoulder, and I turned around, and here's this big black friendly-looking black guy, and he says, Jerry, my name's James Harris, and I wrestle as Sugar Bear Harris, and I live down in Senatobia, and I was wondering if you guys could let me work on some of your shows here. So I'm looking up at this guy, and I said, has anybody seen you here tonight? He said, no, sir. I said, well, look, I want you to go back home. I want you to call me tomorrow. I'm going to take you to Nashville, and I got an idea for you. So anyway, once again, going back to my art career, I remembered I had a good friend that was a great artist named Frank Frazetta. Now, Frank Frazetta did all these covers of these great, like adventure, not comic books, but magazines and stuff that people would read, books, paperback books. And he was a great artist, and I remembered a picture that he had painted of, it was like almost like a Tarzan or somebody's like thing. This this beautiful girl like tied to a stake, and a bunch of these like cannibals were around her, and they were like about to burn her at the stake, right, and have a big feast. And so I went home and I found that picture, and I thought of a gimmick for this guy, this huge guy that just tapped me on the shoulder named James Harris from Senatobia. At the time, we always tried to do stuff that was topical. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but at the time, the president of the country of Uganda was a guy named Idi Amin. And Idi Amin was a confessed cannibal. He was a real live cannibal, and he'd become the president of a country in Africa called Uganda. So in my crazy mind, I thought this guy would be perfect as the Ugandan giant. We book him as a cannibal, and I painted his face up and everything to look just like this cannibal that I saw on this book cover, right? And so paint this guy's face up, put a loincloth around him, put a big spear in his hand. Jerry Jarrett had a big lake in his backyard. We threw some, I'll never forget, it's like yesterday, we threw some dry ice out into that lake, and it just started, smoke started coming up. We told James, said, walk out there till it's about waist deep, and then turn around and just make faces and start coming towards the camera. And so that's we started shooting this guy as he came towards the camera with a spear in his hand, and his, I mean, we would get canceled today if we tried to do this, right? But yeah, we put the spear in his hand, this big African thing, and we called him, and I'm looking at National Geographic magazine, and the country of Uganda is a map of Uganda, and the capital of Uganda is a city called Kampala. So that's where the name came from. We called him Kamala, the Ugandan giant. We made this great video of him, and we called, what was his name? Oh gosh. Oh man, who was the manager for the Four Horsemen?
J.J. Dillon?
J.J. Dillon. We called J.J. Dillon on the phone and said, J.J., we got a new wrestler that we're going to bring in. I want you to shoot a little interview. And he said, I don't even know this guy. I said, no, we just created him. I said, I want you to shoot a little interview. We're going to play on TV, and you say that you've been searching the world for the meanest, toughest professional wrestlers, and you've come across this Ugandan giant, and you're sending him to Memphis to go against me. So we played that video of JJ talking about this guy. Then we played the video of Kamala coming up out of the swamp, and I went out and said, I've never seen anything like this. Anyway, that was the match for Monday night, sold completely out. 11,500 people came to see this guy who was actually from Senatobia, Mississippi, which is about 17 miles from Memphis. They came to see this crazy cannibal Uganda giant. And I told James in the back, I said, look, you're not supposed to know anything about wrestling. You're not to have ever been inside a big building like this. So every time you go out, you just look like you don't know where you're at. I said, don't do anything except chop me and try to bite me, because you're a cannibal, right? And so that was the way Kamala the Ugandan giant was created. And he went on from do huge money for us, and then went on to the WWE and did big business with Hulk Hogan and everybody working for Vince McMahon up there. And as to why he's not in the Hall of Fame, it's just I don't know. It's just a matter. I'm sure he will eventually, but the Hall of Fame exists actually in Vince McMahon's mind. He was the guy every year he would sit down like 3 weeks before that and decide who he was going to put into the Hall of Fame every year. So I don't know why Andy Kaufman is not in the Hall of Fame. But anyway, that's a story on Kamala. He was a great friend of mine, James Harris, and it became like a hassle because I, of course, would have to paint him up every day. And I would have this acrylic paint. I'd sit him down in the dressing room before he and I would go and wrestle each other. And I would paint him from what this guy on this cover looked like. He had a big white star on this pec, a big white star right here, a big yellow crescent moon on his stomach, a star on his head, big teeth here and everything. So I had to paint him up every night. And I do this every night. And so one night after I've been doing this for about 6 months, he's sitting there and watching me, and finally he said, I got one question for you, Jerry. I said, what's that? He said, why does you paint a big banana on my stomach every night? This is a true story. I said, James, that's not a banana. That's a crescent moon. He went, oh, okay. But anyway, he was a cool guy. Yeah.
Yep. There
yes.
You go. So we got time for just a couple more questions. You're going to be headed back to your table to sign and hang out. First of all, I got to tell you, amazing stories right off the bat. We got. Give it up. This is just wonderful. Can't thank you enough. We got 2 more questions. Let's make it happen.
Jerry, one of my favorite feuds of yours was with Randy Savage. How they came in and they did that rival promotion. Like, there was real heat between the two of you from the things I've seen and stuff. What made that?
Did you say there was no heat or
real heat? Okay. Real heat. And then he finally came to Memphis. Well, how'd that all come together? And
that may be
your opinions on Randy.
That may be a longer answer than the Andy Kaufman story, but I'll try to shorten it up. But yeah, I don't know. Have any of you guys got to see any of the Tales from the Territory shows? Well, that's kind of cool because that's the way it used to be in the back before the 80s. In the mid 80s, everything cable television changed everything. It wasn't Vince McMahon. It was cable television that changed wrestling worldwide, because before that, everything was syndicated, everything was local, and there were 32 different territories in the United States. This country was made up of 32 different territories because back then nobody flew. Everybody drove on the trips. So in order to be able to have a wrestling office, and then for the wrestlers to be able to drive to in the middle of a territory would be an office, and then that territory would consist of about 200-mile radius or so of where the main office was, because that's where guys could conceivably drive to a city and then get back home and have if it'd be a 3-hour drive to a city, you'd have a 2-hour show and then a 3-hour drive back home, and that was like an 8-hour workday. That was like you could have a normal life. You're basically working 8 hours, you're driving 6 of it, and you're doing a 2-hour wrestling show. So that's the way it went. Nobody really flew that much back in the day, in the early days of wrestling. So that's why the country was divided up like that. So our territory consisted of all the state of Tennessee, all the state of Kentucky, southern Indiana, eastern Arkansas, and northern Mississippi, and northern Alabama. So that was like a 200-mile radius of Nashville. That's where our main office was. So we would promote cities every single night of the week within that 200-mile radius, and the wrestlers would go out and work those shows every night. Well, back in the day, sometimes you would have what we called opposition, and that would be if a guy that wanted to be a promoter, but he couldn't get a job with the established promotion, sometimes he would just go off on his own and kind of start promoting towns, running wrestling shows, just like what today is independent wrestling. They're not a part of the WWE or anything. They just run independent shows. Well, that would happen sometimes back in the territories, and we call that opposition. And so Randy Savage's father, Landy was his brother. Angelo Poffo was Randy's father. he started opposition to us. He started to run shows on his own in Lexington, Kentucky, which was one of our basically towns that we ran once a month. So Angelo Poffo started, he got a little group of wrestlers, which his son, Lanny, and of course Randy, his son. They were his main stars, and they would just run little towns around Lexington, and they got themselves a TV show on in Lexington. So the way they became sort of popular was they would go on their TV show and challenge all of our main wrestlers, and say that, I'll never forget, Randy Savage would go on TV every week and say, he'd cut a long promo about me, saying what he was going to do to me in the match that we were going to have this week at their little opposition show in a high school gymnasium outside of Lexington, and make the people think that I was going to come there and wrestle him on the show. But then every time at the end of his promo, he'd say, well, that's what's going to happen if he shows up. So that was the way that they were trying to guard themselves, saying that it wasn't false advertising or whatever. But so we all, Jerry Jarrett and I always just had the mindset. The best thing to do with that is just ignore them. So we never talked about them because that would give them credibility. So that really ticked Randy Savage and his dad and his brother off. And one day, to try to put something on their TV show that would give them more credibility. That's all they were doing, looking for some kind of credibility. They sent a camera on a Monday when they knew that I would not be home, when they knew that I would be driving. I was living in Nashville at the time. When they knew that I would be driving to Memphis, Randy Savage and a camera crew of theirs came to my house in Hendersonville, Tennessee, which everybody knew was my house. And he's driving up, and they start filming him driving down my driveway and said, yeah, this is Jerry Lawler's house. I'm going to see if he'll come out and face me right here. He won't come to any of my shows and face me. I'm going to come to him. So he's up there, he goes knocking on my door and all this kind of stuff. And naturally, nobody was there. I was down in Memphis, and he knew that. And then, then he broke a window in my house on this tape, right? So there was real legitimate heat. But then the thing that Jerry Jarrett just kept saying is, we got to just ignore them. He said, I promise you, if we ignore them, they'll die out, they'll go away. So we just ignored them. One time, Randy Savage and Bill Dundee saw each other at a rest stop on the interstate, and they almost came to blows. I think Dundee pulled a gun on him or something. So there was a legitimate kind of heat there. But finally they did just kind of die off and were about to go out of business. They ran out of money, and so they called Jerry Jarrett and I and said, look, is there anything? And actually, I think Randy was about to get a contract to go to WWE. And so we, without telling anybody that we had gotten together on Indiana Way, we booked the match at Rupp Arena in Lexington, Kentucky that would seat 15,000 people, me and Randy Savage in a loser league town match. And so all the people that the people knew about the heat and everything that had happened between the organizations. And so we had to have two referees, one of our referees, one of their referees. We had our ring announcer, Lance Russell, there. They had their ring announcer there. We had Eddie Marlin in my corner, Angelo Poffo in his corner. So it was like a big organizational match. And so then that was the first time that we actually worked together with them, and the last time because they were out of business after that. But, yeah, there was a little heat, but it all turned out well. Randy and I turned out to be good friends and worked together a lot,
And this patient young man has the final question. Once again, thank you. Here's the final question. Nice quick one.
Okay. Now I'm just going to get my luggage unpacked here. Jerry, I am very pleased to speak with you right now. I'm Frank Stover. And WWF, WWE legend? Yeah, I know it sucks. The name change sucks. Yeah, I'm talking to you. We're what? Why fun? Okay, so my question is, how does it feel how does it feel during your commentating career? How does it feel throughout your commentating career? How does it feel to be in that position?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I I never thought about other, I wanted to be a radio disc jockey, but when I got into wrestling, I never even thought about being a commentator. I just never thought about it. I knew there were commentators out there, and I knew that, one of the big things that was important in being a wrestler was your ability to communicate, when you got the microphone in your hand, to be able to talk to the people and get them invested in what you're going to say. So wrestlers' promos were as important as their wrestling ability, and I always knew that. But I never even once thought about being a commentator. And talking about going back to Randy Savage, when I first started and just the other day, as a matter of fact, was my 30-year anniversary of being in WWE. It's 30 years ago, like this week. So almost 30 years ago, I got here and I started wrestling, and I wrestled Bret the Hitman Hart, Jake the Snake Roberts, Ultimate Warrior. I had all these wrestling, feuds and that sort of thing, and then all of a sudden along came the big Monday Night Wars, and that's when WWE and WCW were battling it out for the ratings supremacy, and WCW was trying to steal talent from WWE all the time, and they did steal a lot of guys away. And so at that time, I think I was maybe wrestling against Bret Hart, or about to wrestle against Bret Hart, and Randy Savage was doing the commentating with Vince McMahon. Vince was the play-by-play guy. Randy Savage was the color guy. And so one night, I'll never forget, somewhere up in the Pocono Mountains, we're getting ready to do our show. And at that time, WCW came on an hour before our show did. So they got an hour jump in the ratings game against WWE. So we would be, and a lot of times, we would see what they were going to do before we went on the air. So we were getting ready to do the show, and I'll never forget, Vince was walking around saying, "Anybody seen Randy? I need to get with him about what we're going to talk about on the show tonight." And I hadn't seen him, and everybody said, "No, I hadn't seen him." So anyway, about an hour before the show, somebody said, "Vince, you might want to come and look at this." And they had turned on the WCW show, and all of a sudden, there's Randy. Oh yeah. He jumped ship without telling anybody, and Randy Savage was all of a sudden on WCW that night. And this is another thing I'll never forget. Vince, in the business we call put it over. His expression never changed. He looked at the TV, he saw Randy Savage, and he looked around and he said, "King, would you do commentary with me tonight? And next week I'll have somebody to do it on a regular basis. But will you help me out tonight?" I said, "Yeah." So after that, I was there for the next 25 years. And I can't say I never liked it. I did enjoy it somewhat, but I never went there to be a commentator. I always, my first love was wrestling. And for a while, once I realized I'm just going to be a commentator from now on, I never really liked it that much. But, then they put JR with me, and then they put... for a while, I did commentary with Vince for a long time. I had really enjoyed working with Vince. He was really funny to work with, and I did some commentary with Gorilla Monsoon, and then of course then JR, and then Michael Cole, and a lot of different guys over the years. But now wrestling was always my first love.
And we thank you so much for all the stories.
Thank you, guys.
Give it up, Jerry the King Lawler.
Thank you.
I think you can do a lot better than that. What a great Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I said I've done a lot of panels. Most of the panels I do have about 12 or 14 people at it, but this was great turnout. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Aaron Ashmore, and you are watching Fandom Spotlight. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe like now. Oh, and have fun and follow your fandom.